Good morning. I'm Dr. Hina Pande from the Photogrammetry and Remote Sensing Department at the Indian Institute of Remote Sensing, and I will be taking a session on spectral signatures and image interpretation. I welcome all the participants to this lecture session. I believe that by now you have been exposed to and you've discussed at length the physical process of remote sensing, how images are acquired by various sensors and their specifications, what are the kind of data that is available. Once we get the data, now we will be discussing how to extract information from it or how to interpret the image and extract meaningful information from it. Here in this lecture session, we will be focusing on the visual method of interpretation, and later in the course, you will be discussing digital image interpretation and digital image classification. So now, as you know, that a picture gives us a high amount of information that written words cannot give us, and this is the basic process of remote sensing. You require, the prerequisite is that you require an energy source. Energy from that source travels through the atmosphere, all the while interacting with the constituents of the atmosphere, reaching the target. Here, in this case, it is the surface of the earth. Again, that energy interacts with whatever feature it encounters on the surface of the earth. After that interaction, the amount of energy that reflects or backscatters back towards the sensor is sensed in the form of digital signals, and a digital image is formed, and those signals are then transmitted to the ground receiving stations, pre-processed, and then supplied to users for various kinds of applications for decision making, administrative works, and any other kind of application, natural resources monitoring, and so many other applications. As interpreters, we need to be familiar with the electromagnetic spectrum. This must have been discussed in the previous classes. And the spectrum is, the electromagnetic spectrum is an arrangement of these several regions of the electromagnetic range, which are useful for remote sensing in order of increasing or decreasing wavelengths or frequencies, right? So here the spectrum ranges from the shorter wavelengths, which also include gamma rays, X-rays, UV rays, and so on, to the longer wavelengths, including microwaves and communication waves, that is the radio waves. Now, from within these ranges, there are several regions which are useful for remote sensing. Now, what is image interpretation? We could say that the analysis of remote sensing imagery involves identification of various targets in the image. Targets mean features, right? So these targets would be defined in terms of the way they reflect or emit radiation. If a target emits or reflects more radiation, how would it appear on the image? What kind of signal? It would give us more signal, or would it give us less signal on the image, and vice versa, right? So how would it appear on the image is what the user has to interpret. Radiation is measured and recorded by the sensor, and ultimately this is depicted as the image product. So we can say that the act of examining these images to identify those objects or target features and then to judge what their significance is would be called image interpretation. We could also say that it is an information extraction process from the images, and the visual process of information extraction, or the manual process of information extraction, that which we will be discussing right now, involves a considerable amount of subjective judgment. It is not objective or a mathematical process as is the case with digital image processing. So this is heavily dependent upon the training and the experience of the interpreter, right? And the interpreter would be the specialist who's trained in the study of photography or imagery and how to interpret and extract information using these special images, in addition to being an expert in his or her own discipline. So, for example, a geologist who uses images to uh, extract meaningful information related to, say, mineral exploration or landslide studies and so on and so forth would be an image interpreter or a specialist trained in that particular study. Similarly, a forester or an agricultural expert, or maybe a civil engineer who uses it for various purposes. Right? Just a recap on what an image could be. The image would be a pictorial representation of an object or a scene. It could be analog, that is hard copy, or it could be digital. Now, a digital image is often made up of squares or rectangular areas called pixels or picture elements. Each pixel has an associated pixel value, which depends on the amount of reflected energy from the ground. Now, if you look at this figure here, it is a row and column structure, which results in this square or rectangular areas. This small area, which corresponds to 1 pixel, is the area seen by the sensor. In layman terms, area seen by the sensor at one instance of time. So this is the smallest area imaged by that sensor, right? Now here, because we have multispectral sensors, each image could be composed of multiple regions or multiple bands or channels, each band or channel corresponding to one region of the electromagnetic spectrum. Now, if you see here, each pixel is associated with a digital value or a number, and this is called the digital number. This number corresponds to the amount of reflected energy or backscattered or emitted energy from that region on the ground in this specific wavelength range. Right? So 57 denotes the quantization level of energy that has been recorded by this pixel in band 1. Similarly, there would be values corresponding to the same pixel in other bands as well. Right? With this, we may have multiple bands. So we could have an image corresponding to the red, green, and blue in the visible, and a fourth band which corresponds to the infrared region. I could have multiple other bands as well. This could result in a band combination which I can display as a false color composite. It could be a standard false color composite, or it could be any other composite corresponding to different colors depending upon the combination that I choose. Now, what makes interpretation of imagery more difficult than the everyday visualization or visual interpretation of our surroundings? We as human beings are used to seeing photographs or images of everyday objects. Why is and how is this image interpretation different? To summarize, what happens is that we lose our sense of depth when viewing a two-dimensional image unless we can view it stereoscopically. That means two images with overlapping areas, and then that is used to simulate the third dimension of height. So loss of the third dimension results in confusions as to the interpretational activity. Viewing objects from directly above also provides a very different perspective than what we are familiar with. So what happens here is, since my sensor is looking vertically downwards, I get a vertical view of the tops of the object, right? Now imagine that if you are to decide what the object would be without being able to see any profiles or the facade, it would be slightly difficult. It's an unfamiliar perspective from which we are looking at it. So you have to imagine what the feature would look like when viewed from only on the top. Right? Then combining an unfamiliar perspective with a very different scale and lack of recognizable detail can also make everyday very familiar objects unrecognizable in the image. Right? So scale, because pixel sizes would be different in terms of the spatial resolution. So objects would appear at different sizes, which we are not, there would be different scales and lack of recognizable details, which would make it unrecognizable. And finally, we are used to seeing only in the visible wavelengths, whereas the sensors are designed to look at wavelengths other than the visible range, say, for example, the infrared range. And the imaging of wavelengths outside of this window, that is the visible window or the optical window, it makes things difficult for the human interpreter to comprehend and to interpret and come to a decision. So this is just a recap of what the previous lecturers would already have discussed with you. Data characteristics are important because as interpreters, we need to be aware of what specifications are available in terms of the data that is available to us, which would be the best or optimum combination of these specifications that I need to look for so that I get the optimum amount of information extracted and I come to a logical conclusion and solve the problem at hand. So spectral resolution, radiometric resolution, spatial resolution, and temporal resolution constitute these data characteristics. And I need to choose wisely whether spectral resolution would be of more importance or would it be spatial resolution that would outweigh the other uh, three resolutions. Or if I'm doing a change detection study, I would need temporally varying images. Which ones? So it's up to the interpreter to decide which one is of more importance, which one should be weighted more, right? Now, what would be the advantages of using these images over ground observations? Most importantly, these sensors provide us with a synoptic view. So I get to see objects in relation to other objects in the vicinity. This helps me to establish relationships and come up with a better interpretation. It aids interpretation. It's a permanent record. I get varying spectral resolutions and varying spatial resolution. So I can view the same object in different wavelength bands and at different levels of detail by varying the spatial resolution. I also get, as because temporal resolution also varies, so I can get temporally varying images images or data for the same area at variable points of time, different points of time. Ultimately, the whole process comes out to be more cost and time effective. Also, it gives me a stereoscopic view. Special sensors are deployed to give you overlapping images, and with this I can generate a 3D view and then do 3D analysis, right? Because it gives me a synoptic view, it gives me an I can easily interpret context as I can see relationships between objects also. Right. Now the next section would be about spectral signatures. How do I decide which objects correspond to what features on the ground? So identifying or a unique identifier, associate a unique identifier with each object and each pixel is very necessary. How do we do that? So as we see in everyday life, signatures or unique identifiers like biometric analysis or signatures, etc., constitutes these unique identifiers. So characteristic features which form the key to enable an object to be identified would be a signature. And with this remotely sensed data, spectral, spatial, temporal, and polarization variations which facilitate discrimination of features on remotely sensed data are these signatures, or are the properties which we use as signatures to identify features. So what we use is something called a spectral reflectance curve. This curve is a graph or a plot of the spectral reflectance values of an object as a function of the wavelength on one axis and the amount of reflectance in percentage on the other axis. So this results in this curve, and this is a characteristic curve of various land cover features. This is known as a spectral reflectance curve. Laboratory generated or field generated curves are compared to the data that I interpret from the image, and a matching process is done, and hence features are identified. Right? So if you see here in the visible range, clear water reflects very little in the visible portion, and most of the energy is absorbed, almost all of the energy is absorbed in the infrared region. So a clear water body in the infrared band would appear dark. It would reflect very little, so some amount of gray would appear in the visible region. Now for the vegetation, which is green, so please also note that the physical condition of the object is of utmost importance. So when we are doing interpretation, we need to remember two things. One, the physical condition of the object, and the region of the electromagnetic spectrum that we are viewing that object in. So here you see this is healthy green vegetation. Now here you see there are dips, and then there are rises, and then there is a plateau. So these dips occur at characteristic points in the wavelength region or the spectrum. These are water absorption dips due to water absorption at these positions in the spectrum. Here you see this is a steep rise, and almost 50% or 45% of the energy is reflected by healthy green vegetation in the infrared as soon as it comes to the infrared. Then there is a plateau, right? So this is the characteristic curve of healthy green vegetation. Now if due to any reason the greenness of the plant changes, whether it is due to a disease or maybe due to water stress or maybe due to change in growth stage, this curve, the shape and size of this curve will change, and this is what the interpreter has to interpret. Right? Similarly, there would be other spectral reflectance curves for characteristic land use, land cover features. We'll look at them one by one. Right? So the spectral reflectance curve for vegetation, we just discussed that. So these regions, I've marked regions, water absorption dips due to water content in the leaf cell. Here, leaf pigment, right? Now, what are the characteristics that would affect the reflectance from a healthy green vegetation? One is the presence of chlorophyll. So chlorophyll reflects green energy more than red and blue, and this gives plants its green color. So change in the thickness of the leaf, the shape of the leaf, right? All this would affect. So needle-leafed plants, broad-leafed plants, change in the growth stage, all these would affect the reflectance curve, and interpreters study these curves and then come to a conclusion about the condition of the plant or the physical condition of the feature, right? So due to disease, if leaves start yellowing or turning brown, right, so they would no longer have enough amount of chlorophyll, there would be a change in the chlorophyll, and therefore they would be different from the healthy green vegetation, and this would indicate some sort of stress due to a disease or maybe water, etc. Similarly, for soil, the spectral signature would be affected by moisture content, organic content, the structure of the soil, that is whether it is clayey soil or sandy soil, etc., and the iron oxide content, also the texture. Texture would be connected to the structure of the soil. Okay? So a wet soil would generally appear darker because of the presence of water. We saw earlier that in the optical region or in the visible region, water would result in absorption of the energy in the infrared region. Very little reflectance in the optical region. Right? Dry soils would therefore appear very bright in these regions. Similarly, iron and organic content would also result in darkness, higher reflectance. Right? Less decomposed organic material have higher reflectance in the near infrared region. Right? A very highly decomposed organic material show low reflectance throughout the spectrum. Similarly, soil iron content in the soil. Right? Then the structure. Right? So sandy soils tend to have a low moisture content, and this results in fairly high and often specular reflectance properties. Right? Then spectral signature for water. Here again it would depend upon whether what the depth of water is, whether it's shallow or deep, how much amount of or what is the suspended material, sand, algae, etc., pollutants, chlorophyll content, and surface roughness. All these would result in various changes in the spectral reflectance curve. These are all physical conditions which would affect the spectral reflectance curve. Shallow water would give us some amount of reflectance in the land water boundary. As we go deeper and we use the infrared band, water would appear dark on the image. Suspended material would contribute to some amount of reflectance. So it will be easier to identify pollutants and suspended material in the water by looking at these changes in the curve. Chlorophyll content, so phytoplanktons, algae, etc. These would, if they have chlorophyll in them or any other pigment, all that would be identifiable by looking at the spectral reflectance curve and property that we are able to see on the image. Also surface roughness, that if it is standing calm water, it would appear dark. If there is choppy, there's a wind and there are waves, that would result in change in the physical feature and therefore change in the spectral reflectance curve also. Right? Then snow, if we look at snow, then it is affected, the reflectance is affected by grain size, snow, the thickness, how much liquid water content, is it melted snow or is it compact ice, and what are the pollutants or contaminants present. All this would affect the amount of reflection. Now, this is just all of them put together. One could study it. You could study this at leisure and then make your observations. Now, this is depicting single bands of a multispectral image displayed, each band of the constituent bands of a multispectral image displayed singly. So here you can see the difference, and you can also judge what features are best interpretable in a particular band. So if there is proper contrast between the feature and the background, then interpretation is optimum or best. Again, a true color composite or a natural color composite. This is the band combination used. This is a false color composite in which vegetation features here appear red, built up features and sand appears in the cyan tone, water appears in dark, right? So here you see shallow water appears light blue, and as we go deeper inside it becomes darker. Similarly here, vegetation, agriculture area, built up areas, fallow land, bare soil, river with sand, and there's water in the channel. This is a reservoir, right? Dry streams. All these are visible here. This is again a standard false color composite. Now we come to what methods could be employed for this extraction of information or image interpretation. It can broadly be categorized into two components, that is the visual and the digital. So in this session we are going to be discussing the visual method of interpretation. We could do a visual interpretation on a hard copy image or photograph manually. We take a printout or a photographic print and use that to assign a classification scheme to the image or the features on the image. Or we could use a digital image displayed on a screen and do visual extraction of information or visual interpretation. The second kind is the digital image processing, and this will be dealt with in detail in the latter part of the module. While doing interpretation, we could do a qualitative interpretation. What are the objects? Is it built up area? Is it vegetation? Right? We could also do a quantitative analysis. What are the length? What is the area? Right? Etc. Now, what we need to remember is that similar objects under similar conditions would reflect similarly. An example would be that if you look at shadows and water, they will both appear dark in the standard false color composite. Now, they are both physically different features, right? But since they are reflecting similarly under similar conditions on that image, they would look and reflect similarly. So, there is a chance that while doing a digital image classification without verifying uh, or doing a validation, these could be clubbed into the same category. Similarly, if I have, say, river sand, dry river sand, and built up areas, because construction material has sand as a constituent. If you look at the previous images that I just showed you, you will see that they have a cyan tone. So they reflect similarly, even though they are physically different features. Right? So this is what the interpreter has to be aware of. Now, physical conditions of the object and the region of the spectrum in which we are seeing that object are also of utmost importance. We need to establish a relationship between the two and then do the interpretation. Right? Of course, methodology will depend upon the kind of information that has to be interpreted. We need to fix the specifications, whether I need spectral resolution, higher spectral resolution for the interpretation that I'm doing, or whether I need a high spatial resolution, or temporally varying information is needed for change analysis, and so on and so forth. So, data selection criteria would depend upon the application. What kind of, so geologists would need different kinds of data sets. Foresters would need different kinds of data sets. Administrators and decision makers would, put everything together, and so on and so forth. So urban analysts would need different kinds of data sets. So the selection criteria would depend on application for which the data is being used, what sensors and platforms are available, and what are the data characteristics. So whether spatial information, details are high amount of detail is required, so a high spatial resolution would be more suitable. If the time of day is important, for example, in thermal imagery, or whether I need to do change analysis. So do I need data at a particular cycle, temporally varying data? If high spectral information is required, it's similarly reflecting data. For example, minerals, identification of different types of minerals, or species identification of trees, and so on. So building material needs to be distinguished, then high spectral information is needed. And therefore, data selection, what I'm stressing here is the data selection criteria will depend upon the application, the sensor or the platform that I decide to use, and the data characteristics that would help me in optimum amount of information extraction. It would optimize the information extraction process. Then the next important section of the discussion is, after spectral signatures, the elements that comprise the basis of image interpretation. Recognizing targets, as we have seen, is the key to interpretation and information extraction. Now, to help us in this process of recognition, the targets are observed based on the differences in one or more of these visual elements of interpretation. These are tone, texture, pattern, shape, size, shadow, and association. And if we have a stereoscopic image, then we can also see height. So height becomes an element of interpretation in that case. So tone refers to the relative brightness or color of the object, and it is the most primary element of interpretation. As you can see, as soon as there is a tonal change, it translates into an edge. And if I'm able to identify that edge will indicate change, sorry, will indicate change from one feature to the other, or change in the physical condition of the same feature. So if it is dry area, dry soil, yes, or a fallow field, yes, then this dark field would indicate either moisture, standing crop, right, and changes in the gray scale would indicate similar changes in physical features. So tone is generally the fundamental element for distinguishing different targets or features. The second element is shape, and this refers to the general form, structure, or outline of individual objects. Right? So shape can be very distinctive clue for identification of features. Certain features are always associated, we associate certain shapes with certain features. Now, if you look at this elliptical feature, immediately an athletic track would come to mind. Right? Linear features, roads, railway lines. These circular features are farm or cropland irrigated by rotating sprinkler systems, and therefore they are in circular shape. Whereas we are used to seeing typical agricultural fields as squares or rectangular areas. Right? Now, the size of the object is a function of scale. So the size of the object, we need to connect that with the resolution of the pixel, right? Then we come to pattern. Pattern refers to the spatial arrangement of visibly distinguishable objects. Typically, an orderly repetition of similar tones and textures will produce a distinctive and recognizable patterns. For example, if I need to distinguish between forest, naturally growing forest, and orchards. So orchards will have evenly spaced trees because it's a man-made feature. This, when I view from a vertical perspective, these rows and columns will be visible in the form of a regular pattern, whereas a naturally growing forest will grow irregularly. Urban streets with regularly spaced houses. So a planned urban colony can be distinguished from a, a slum area or a not so planned urban scene. Now, the next feature and a very important element is texture. This refers to the arrangement and frequency of tonal variation in a particular area of the image, which means I need to see and analyze how frequently is tone changing in the image. Now, if you look at this is a homogeneous area, no tonal variations, so it appears visually smooth. The texture appears to be visually smooth. So, homogeneous areas where there is no frequent change of tone is texturally smooth when I'm visually looking at it. On the other hand, I can make a distinction between these two halves of the image where there are frequent variations in tone. Bright, gray, dark, very dark, and this is a textural difference. So this appears to be rough in the as when I look at the texture. Shadows usually provide or are thought of as occlusions or noise, but sometimes they provide us an idea of the profile and the relative height of the target. This could make identification easier, especially when we lack stereoscopic detail. So if I don't have the third dimension, shadows could help me, look at and analyze relative heights of objects. Then comes association. This feature or this element takes into account the relationship between the object and other recognizable objects or features in the proximity of the feature of interest. Right? So you would identify these associated features and then come to a conclusion as to what the feature might be or why it is in that condition. For example, commercial properties would be associated with proximity to major transportation routes, whereas residential areas would be associated with parking lots, sports fields, playgrounds, schools, and so on. Right? Now, this is just a comparison to show you a true color composite and a standard false color composite. So you see this here features appear in their naturally occurring colors, and here they have colors different to those that occur actually on the ground or on the terrain. So built up areas appear in the cyan tone, various tones of red for different kinds of vegetation, and so on. Now, after we've discussed spectral signatures and the elements of interpretation, I would like to show you a few sample images wherein we can make use of these one or more elements of interpretation to make an analysis of what the features and the condition of physical feature condition of the features would be and what phenomena might be occurring. So if you look at this is a Landsat image, fairly coarse, medium to coarse resolution, spatial resolution. This dark feature would be a water body. Red features, since it's a standard false color composite, would be vegetation features. Tonal variations would indicate whether it's a grassland or whether it's a bush or a scrub forest or a dense forest, and so on. Similarly, these dark features, polygons, are water bodies. Cyan tones would be dry areas, could also be built up areas, but since it is very near the coast, it was more likely to be dry, sandy areas. Right? So this is the beach sand, as you can see, very, very bright sandbars. Similarly here, part of the channel has water content. The other part, probably due to a reservoir or something, has become dry. So very bright channel. Again, arid type of landscape. Here you see it says mid-infrared image, which means it's using the middle infrared region of the spectrum, which also corresponds to the thermal region of the spectrum. If you look at this, it is Stromboli Island, which is a volcanic island. So here you see the center here is very bright yellow orange, indicating the burning lava within the crater, and the mountain has vegetation. Then we also see bare rocks, and at the base there could be some settlements which are in cyan tone. Then here this is again circular features which indicate the sprinkler irrigation system, usually found in dry arid regions. The red color indicates standing crop vegetation, standard false color composite, and darker ones indicate these indicate fallow fields. The bright cyan tone is sand, and the ones with the dark areas are fallow with moisture content. So you see these fields, half of it is with standing crop, the other half is fallow, and it is also moist because it is dark. Right? So varying moisture content, different conditions as to whether it has standing crop or whether it is fallow, right? No crop, and the sandy area in between. Similarly here, it is a sea coast, beach sand here, suspended material, right? Other urban features can be seen here. Then a delta region. So you see lots of silt. If we are able to see the other, a larger part of the image, then all the rivers have come together to deposit all the silt. Mangrove kind of vegetation would be associated with this area. Darker feature of the vegetation indicates that there was moisture here, So probably the ingression of the tide, and here the brighter features, which is also vegetation but dry. A very mountainous, rocky terrain, absolutely bare rocks, no vegetation or very, very sparse vegetation here. Urban scenes where we can see built up areas, parks, uh, roads, railway lines, airports, airstrips, and associated features, right? Water bodies, agricultural fields, aircraft, airfields here again, right? Runways, and other urban features, including water bodies and built up areas, roads, railway lines, and so on. Now, here you can see again the bright beach sand, vegetation features, of course, and waves on the, so this is a rough texture, waves on the waterfront. So, rough texture. Also, suspended material near the coast. A very high spatial resolution, sub-meter spatial resolution, which gives us more detail, very high amount of detail in terms of the features that can be seen. Industrial setup with chimneys, storage tanks, maybe chemical tanks or whatever, and storage sheds. These are all associated with industrial kind of setup. Now here you see this is a famous building, the Pentagon in the United States, and here you see it is the same image pertaining to two dates, and there is a change in the physical condition of the building. Parts of the building have been affected and have been damaged. So you see here undamaged state, and here it is damaged. So we can do a change detection if I have temporally varying data. The first image has agricultural fields. Different textures can be seen. Tonal variations can also be seen in the agricultural fields as well as the orchards here. Also, if you notice, there are these standing poles, if you are able to see. These are windmills. Once we share this PPT with you, you will be able to zoom in and see that the shadow here gives you an idea of the shape of the fan for the windmill, which is not visible very clearly in some of them when you have a vertical perspective. Right? Now these two images are of the desert region, and these have sandy areas corresponding to sand dunes, longitudinal dunes here, and crescent shaped dunes here, which are also called barkhans. These images correspond to white, very bright features. If you look at all of them, they are all at geographically different, they are all different geographic entities. So here if you see, it is snow, high mountains, snowbound mountains with glaciers. This is sea coast, so salt pans, incrustations of salt pans, salt is being processed and manufactured. This puffy cotton wool like texture with a shadow is a cloud, right? So similarly reflecting features, but they are all physically different, right? This is the point I wanted to make, that you need to know different characteristics of the feature, and you need to put several clues together to get to the correct interpretation. They may spectrally all give you similar, if they are reflecting similarly, they will look similar on the image. So the tonal variation is same, but when you put other elements of interpretation together, association, size, shape, texture, pattern, stereoscopic uh, ability or height, then we come to a correct conclusion as to what the feature might be. Similarly here, these are all urban setups. This is a brick kiln. You see the chimney, also the shadow, excavated area nearby, brick stacks, right? And probably the oven near here. Railway lines, a railway station, overbridges, a stadium, roads, built up areas, and so on. Here, a very densely populated area, high rise buildings with shadows, yes, well planned. So we see a pattern here, we don't see a pattern here. It's irregularly spaced, irregular pattern. A regular pattern can be seen. Again here, very high resolution data, spatial resolution. So here we are also able to see the air conditioning units, uh, storage tanks, maybe water storage tanks and so on the rooftop. Markings on the roads, vehicles parked on the road, individual vehicles can also be identified. Even the markings on the roads are visible. Right? So very, very high resolution image. Again, this is also a very high resolution image. This is an this is a residential area. This is an industrial area. Right? So associations are different. So depending upon what kind of analysis one needs to do or what kind of interpretational activity is expected, we will choose whether spatial, spectral, radiometric or temporal resolution, what kind of data we require. Right? Now we'll just do a small exercise. You can do it on your screens. Using the elements of interpretation, I would like you to go through these features marked 1 to 5, and then we can, let us see if we can interpret these features. So number 1, linear features. These are roads. So the shape and tone would be characteristic features which you would use to interpret these. This feature number 2 is a reservoir, right? Association with the river and the shape. 3, also a linear feature, but this could be a bridge, yes, because it's associated with the water body, right? That is how you distinguish between the road and the bridge. Number 4 is a water body, dark, so infrared band would have been used in the image. Number 5, elliptical feature, probably an athletic field, part of a stadium or games, right? So just an exercise to emphasize how elements of interpretation, one or more, are put together and used for interpretation and extraction of information from these remotely sensed images, aerial photographs or satellite images. Right? Now, this is just a comparison. You would probably be able to make more sense of it when the digital image processing has also been discussed. But just to make a summary, and I've compared manual and digital analysis. So manual interpretation and analysis is the beginnings. It dates back to the very early beginnings of photo interpretation, whereas digital image analysis is more recent. Uh, Manual interpretation requires little, if any, specialized equipment. Digital analysis, on the other hand, requires some equipment and specialized training. Manual interpretation is often limited to analyzing only a single channel of data or a particular combination of the bands at one time. However, for digital image analysis, the computer environment is of course more amenable to handling these complex images of several channels or from several dates together. Manual interpretation is a subjective process this means that the results might vary with different interpreters slightly. Digital analysis, on the other hand, is based on the manipulation of digital numbers on a computer, using a computer, that is hardware and software, and this is therefore more objective, generally resulting in more consistent results. However, these results, the validity and the accuracy of the results from digital image processing may be difficult. As I said, the digital classifier would find it difficult to distinguish between similarly reflecting objects like shadows and water or built up areas and sand, which the human interpreter is less likely to confuse between. So therefore, it is very important to reiterate again and again that Visual and digital analyses of the remote sensing imagery are not mutually exclusive. They are not two different processes, but they need to work together. And in most cases, a mixture of both methods is usually employed when we analyze imagery. And the ultimate decision of the utility and relevance of the information extracted at the end of the analysis process is the validation is made by the human interpreter, right? So the reference that you use to check the validation, the best reference would always be visually interpreted data. Digital image analysis, of course, has its own advantages. Right? With this, we come to the end of this session.